Hi everyone, my name is Riley Sullivan and this is my Math 123 Elementary Statistics Dollar Street project. So for the topic of interest for my project, I chose refrigerators. This is something that I personally see as a necessity, so I wanted to compare how different continents around the world have access to these items. Looking at the continents of interest for this project, I chose the Americas, which in the Dollar Street data represents both North America and South America as one continent, and Africa, which is just a continent by itself. So what is a success in this study or this experiment? I defined a refrigerator as any tool or appliance, standing or box style, that ran on electricity and produced cold temperatures. So on the left, you can see in Mexico, that is very clearly a refrigerator. It's electric, it's plugged into the wall, and you can tell that it's going to be producing cold temperatures on its own. And then on the right, you can see in Burundi, they just have hollowed out a stump to create some shade and some storage for the food. And I consider that a failure because obviously it cannot produce cold temperatures and run on electricity by itself. Looking at successes in Africa, you can see everything that is clearly a fridge was marked with a green plus symbol, and everything that is not a fridge is marked with a red negative sign. You can see here in Ghana, they are using just a cooler. It cannot produce cold temperatures on its own through electricity. And then in Malawi, it's just a plain dish or handle spoon that has food resting in it. Same thing for success in Americas. You can see everything that is clearly a fridge is marked with a green plus sign. And then in Peru and Haiti, the failures are marked with a red negative sign, and you can tell that this is not a fridge, this is just a storage area, and this is somebody keeping their fresh produce in the shade behind some baskets. So looking at the data for Africa, in Africa the population proportion is P1 equals the proportion of all people living in Africa that own a refrigerator. The sample size for Africa was 30, and the sample proportion for Africa is P hat 1, which is 23 over 30, which ends up being this value you see here. Looking at the Americas, the population proportion is P2 equals the proportion of all people living in the Americas that own a refrigerator. The sample size is N2 equals 72, and the sample proportion is 69 over 72, which ends up getting you this value here, 0.958, with some 3's at the end, but with rounding, we'll call it 0.958. Now looking at the hypothesis test, our null hypothesis is HO is P1 minus P2 is equal to 0. This is saying that there is no difference in the proportion of all people living in the Americas and Africa that own a refrigerator. While the alternative hypothesis is H1 is P1 minus P2 does not equal 0. This is saying that there is a difference in the proportion of all people living in the Americas and Africa that own a refrigerator. Looking at our Z statistic, it measures out as negative 2.966058, and the p-value is 0.003016. And when we're looking at the p-value compared to alpha, which was 0.05, it's obviously much smaller than alpha, so we're going to reject HO because there is convincing evidence that the proportion of people living in Africa and the Americas that own a refrigerator is vastly different. Next, I did a 95% confidence interval. You can see that the lower limit of this confidence interval is 0.349897, and the upper limit for this 95% confidence interval is 0.033436. And what this means is we can be 95% confident that the true difference in the proportion of people who own refrigerators in Africa and the Americas falls within this interval. I'd also like to know that the confidence interval doesn't include 0, so this means that there's no possibility that the proportions could be equal, which only confirms our hypothesis test that we're going to be rejecting the null hypothesis and accepting the alternative hypothesis, which is there is indeed a difference between the proportion of all people living in the Americas and Africa that own a refrigerator. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to watch my video and listen to my presentation, And I'd like to thank Gapminder, Data, and Dollar Street for providing everything for this project.